It had been one of those days. The kind where you wake up already tired before your feet even hit the floor. Life was a blur of work, meetings, emails, and expectations. When I walked into the kitchen that morning, I barely noticed the slow, persistent drip of water from the sink. It was only when I stepped into a small puddle that I finally acknowledged the issue. The damn thing was leaking. Great, I thought. Another problem to deal with. I didn't have time to fix it myself, especially not when I was already drowning in 1,000 other things. So, I did what anyone would do. I called the plumber. It wasn't the worst thing that could happen, I told myself. My life had become a series of minor inconveniences, one after the other. A leaky faucet was just another one to add to the list. Still, I wasn't in the mood to deal with it. I just wanted some quiet, maybe a little break from everything. I needed a breather. But as I paced around the apartment waiting for the plumber, I couldn't shake this strange unease. It was as if I knew that some small, inconsequential event was about to change the pattern of my life. I brushed it off as nothing, focusing instead on making a cup of coffee. I was just tired. I needed the plumber to fix the sink, get him out, and go back to the familiar monotony. But when I opened the door to find him standing there, I knew I had been wrong. This was no ordinary repair. He wasn't who I expected. "Hi, I'm Nick," he said, his voice deep and calm, like he was used to people feeling unsettled in his presence. He stepped into my space without hesitation, carrying an air of confidence that immediately made me uneasy in ways I couldn't place. "Sarah," I replied, trying to sound composed, though I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped aside to let him in. There was something about him, something off-kilter that I couldn't quite pinpoint. He was just a plumber, I told myself. This was nothing. But the way he moved, the way he looked around my apartment like he was assessing more than just the pipes, it unsettled me. It felt personal, even though I barely knew him. "The sink's in here," I said, leading him to the kitchen. My voice sounded far too tight, even to my own ears. As I stepped into the room, I felt him follow closely behind, too close. I wasn't used to this kind of presence, and the awareness of his proximity made me feel out of place. He bent down in front of the sink, immediately going to work. I stood back, unsure of what to do with myself. Part of me wanted to retreat, to go somewhere else, but another part of me didn't. Something about the way Nick handled himself, so calm, so assured, kept me rooted to the spot. "It's a little stuck," he muttered, his hands moving under the sink with purpose. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made me pause. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on beneath the surface. I didn't know what it was, but I was caught. "Everything okay?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if it was the pipes or the man I was talking about. He glanced up at me, his eyes dark and intense, locking onto mine for a moment too long. I couldn't look away. It felt like he was reading me, peeling back the layers of something I hadn't even realized I was hiding. "Yeah," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my chest tighten. "But sometimes you have to let things break before you can fix them." His words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't just about the sink. It was something more. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. I was suddenly very aware of the space between us. He stood up, stretching, and his hand brushed against mine as he reached for his tools. I felt a jolt run through me, almost as if the touch had triggered something I hadn't anticipated. I tried to pull my hand away, but the touch lingered in my memory. "Careful," he said, his voice lowering. The words were gentle, but they held an intensity one wasn't ready for. Something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, made me feel exposed. Like he could see into my soul. And suddenly, it wasn't just about the sink anymore. I couldn't explain what was happening, but it wasn't just the sink anymore. The air between Nick and I was thick with something I couldn't name, something magnetic and dangerous. The quiet hum of the kitchen seemed to fade as I stood there, watching him. Every move he made was deliberate, controlled, and yet, every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into something I wasn't sure I could get out of. Nick's hands worked methodically under the sink, tightening and loosening pipes, his brow furrowing as he focused on the task at hand. But it wasn't the plumbing that held my attention, it was him. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just fixing my sink, he was reading me in a way no one had before. "Almost done," he said, his voice calm, like he was trying to reassure me. But something in the way he looked at me, the way his lips curled slightly at the edges, made me wonder if there was something more to his words. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt the need to fill the silence. "Thank you for coming out so quickly," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered slightly. I hated how vulnerable I felt around him, even though he hadn't said anything to make me feel that way. "No problem," Nick replied, still focused on the sink. "Sometimes it's not the big things that matter. It's the little things that get overlooked." He glanced up at me again, eyes flicking over my face, and this time, I couldn't look away. He wasn't just talking about the plumbing anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I swallowed hard, trying to control the sudden rush of emotions I felt flooding through me. Was he talking about me? Was I imagining it? "I guess I've been overlooking a lot of things lately," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know why I'd said it, but it felt like the truth, like something I had been running from for far too long. Nick's eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd walked into my apartment, his expression wasn't one of complete control. There was something real there, something unspoken that passed between us in that brief moment. He straightened up from under the sink, and for a second, neither of us moved. His proximity, his presence, it felt like he was everywhere. Like I could feel his every breath. And I didn't know if I wanted him to step back or closer. "I think we all overlook things," Nick said slowly, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "The trick is realizing it before it's too late." I didn't respond immediately. His words had dug deep into something I'd been ignoring for months, maybe even years. There was a knot in my chest, one I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. He had a way of making me confront things I wasn't ready to face. Nick moved toward me then, his steps deliberate, slow, as if he were weighing every moment. I held my breath, the space between us closing. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, matching my own. I wanted to step back. I wanted to push him away and tell him to leave, to go back to his world of plumbing and routine. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me question why I was so afraid to let him in. And then, without thinking, I reached out. My hand brushed his arm, a soft touch that seemed to electrify the room. His gaze shifted to mine, and for a moment, it was like time had stopped. His eyes flickered down to my lips, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. "Sarah." Nick's voice was barely a whisper now, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to pretend you're fine." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was happening between us, but I couldn't deny the pull, the need for something more than just this moment. I didn't want him to leave, but I was terrified of what it meant for him to stay. Before I could answer, Nick closed the distance between us, his lips pressing softly against mine. The kiss was gentle at first, like he was giving me the space to pull away, but I didn't. I didn't want to pull away. My body responded before my mind could catch up, and I found myself sinking into the kiss, into the warmth of him. It wasn't fast or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every second of it. And I let him. When he finally pulled away, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to say. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Nick murmured, his voice rough. But I could hear the honesty in it, and something in my chest loosened. "You didn't," I whispered back, finally opening my eyes to meet his gaze. There was no shame in his eyes, no regret. There was only understanding. The silence stretched out between us, thick with emotions we hadn't voiced but had both been carrying. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't the end of the story. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. "I should go," Nick said quietly, stepping back just enough to give me space. His eyes searched mine one last time, as if asking permission. I nodded, my throat tight. "Thank you for everything." He gave me a small smile, a hint of something in his gaze that told me this wasn't the end. "Anytime, Sarah," he said, before turning and heading toward the door. As the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, my hands still resting on the kitchen counter, my heart still racing. The tension from before had dissipated, but in its place was something else, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the same as I was before he walked in. He had fixed the sink, sure. But he had also fixed something inside me, something that had been broken for too long.